Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Vestibular Disorders Association, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on tinnitus. Today, we're going to be talking about the mechanisms behind tinnitus, how it's diagnosed and treated, as well as coping strategies. Our presenters today are audiologist Barbara Grossman and tinnitus patient Glenn Schweitzer, who is also the author of Rewiring Tinnitus, which is a book and an online blog. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started. All attendees are logged in listen-only mode, but you can type questions into the questions or chat sections, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing Barbara Grossman, who is a clinical audiologist and has been for 30 years, specializing in disorders of hearing and balance. She has been involved with VITA for many years and has supported Balance Awareness Week, which, if you don't know already, is this week. And I hope that you will check out our website and our Facebook page for ways to participate in that. That's vestibular.org/BAW for Balance Awareness Week. Barbara has worked with neurotologists in private and hospital settings, and she's been working in private practice for the past 10 years. Also was former secretary and treasurer of the Tri-State Vestibular Disorders Society. So without further ado, I'd like to have Barbara go ahead and take over for us. Barbara?
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and good evening to everybody. My name is Barbara Grossman, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about this important topic of tinnitus tonight. I'd like to thank Cynthia and the Vestibular Disorders Society for inviting me here this evening to talk about this topic. Our goal today with this webinar is hopefully to demystify tinnitus and provide tools and coping mechanisms so that you can be successful managing your own tinnitus. Following my portion of this webinar, Glenn Schweitzer will talk about his journey from diagnosis to management. So let's begin. So, how do we really pronounce tinnitus? My patients will come in, and one of the first things they will say to me is, I've been diagnosed with, is it tinnitus or tinnitus? And honestly, both are appropriate pronunciations. And the word itself comes from the Latin from tenere, or ringing or clanging or jangling in the ears. For those of you who are old enough to know what the Merriam-Webster dictionary is, the definition of tinnitus is a sensation of noise, such as a ringing or roaring, that is usually of the subjective form, and it can only be heard by the patient themselves. The Mayo Clinic defines tinnitus as the perception of noise or ringing in the ears. The one thing that we have to remember this evening is tinnitus is not a condition in and of itself. It is a symptom of an underlying condition.
Okay, well, let us start out by asking a poll question. You can all participate in this poll question. We would like to know if you were diagnosed with tinnitus or given another diagnosis and tinnitus was just a symptom of it. So I've got the poll in progress, and I hope you see that on your screen. Please participate in the poll. I'll leave it up for just a little while so that we can give everyone an opportunity to participate before I close the poll. We've got people voting. I'll just leave it on for just a few more seconds. So far, okay, I think that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. 30% of our respondents, 30% of the people who are attending said that they were diagnosed with tinnitus, whereas 70% said they received another diagnosis, and tinnitus is a symptom of that diagnosis. Thanks so much for participating, everyone.
Well, I am very surprised and happy to hear that the majority of people were not diagnosed with tinnitus, because as we are going to talk about very much, tinnitus in and of itself is not a diagnosis. So that's really a very good piece of information to know going forward. So, what exactly is tinnitus? Tinnitus is a symptom, it is not a disease. And we will talk about that constantly because a lot of people feel that it is a disease and that's what they are diagnosed with. About 10 to 20% of Americans report clinically significant tinnitus, meaning that this tinnitus is affecting them in some way or another in their daily lives. The presence of a sound in the absence of an external stimulus is what tinnitus actually is, and it can occur in one ear, in both ears, or very often patients will report that they have some kind of a head noise. So what are some of the impacts of the tinnitus? Tinnitus can cause distress in about 25% of the population. It can cause depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, frustration, poor concentration, and avoiding social situations. So the depression and the anxiety really come from the fact that a patient may not know why they have tinnitus. They've got this unwanted sound and they've become depressed and anxious. They can't sleep at night because when it's quiet, your tinnitus tends to be much worse. So they're thinking about the tinnitus. It makes you more anxious, and therefore you are not sleeping. And anybody that has been sleep deprived for any period of time knows that it makes it very difficult to go through your daily life with any success. It's very frustrating often because we don't know where the tinnitus is coming from and we don't know what to do about it. We can't concentrate at work because all we're thinking about is the tinnitus. And all of these things ultimately lead to us avoiding social situations because we don't want to go out. We don't feel well, we're tired, we're anxious. A lot of people feel anxious about the fact that, will it get louder? Will it ever go away? Will I lose my hearing? Will I have to live with this the rest of my life? Do I have a brain tumor? That's the first place that people go when they think about tinnitus. I must have a tumor in my brain, and therefore I become much more anxious. Unfortunately, many patients are told there is no cure and that they will have to learn to live with it. And that, of course, is very anxiety provoking, which leads the tinnitus to be louder.
Here. So the question is, my healthcare provider told me I just have to live with it. Yes, you were given no treatment options, or no, your healthcare provider provided you with treatment options. We ask this question because what we hear so often is that people are told you just have to live with it. So we're really curious to see how many people were told that. And I'm going to also just let you know, I've been getting a question that some people can't see the slides. I'm going to try to correct that now. So if you hold on, if everyone could hold on just a moment while I try to figure out what that technical problem is. We are going to, okay, there. I hopefully that corrected it, and I'm going to close the poll. And interestingly, 89% said they were given no treatment options. 11% said that they were provided with treatment options. I find that amazing and distressing, Barbara. I don't know about you.
Absolutely, that is incredibly distressing because there are treatment options, there are management options, and I truly believe that most people are told that there are no options because a fair number of physicians out there either don't know how to deal with it or don't want to deal with it. So I think that that's something that we really have to focus on and change going forward. So what can we do? First and foremost, a patient needs reliable information. Information is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And that's very important when you're trying to find out what may be wrong with you. The problem with that is that sometimes too much knowledge is not a good thing. And now that we have what I like to call the Google machine and we have the internet available to us 24/7, that's what happens with patients. They tend to go on the internet and try to self-diagnose and figure out what the problem is and what they can do about it. I've had many patients come into my office and tell me that they have been on the internet for the past week, 24 hours a day, looking for information, trying to find out what's wrong with them, and that's making them anxious, and their tinnitus is at an unbearable level by the time they get to me. So many years ago, I tried an experiment, and I asked the patient to completely stay off the internet for 1 week, which is not easy for a lot of people to do, but I had a friend or a significant other monitor that for me. And I asked them to come back in 1 week. And on their return to my office, 100% of the time, their tinnitus was at least 85 to 90% reduced, and they were feeling much better. So that really goes a long way to show that too much information about problems that may not apply to your particular case is not a good thing. We can give the patients hope that not that there's a cure, but there's a way to manage the tinnitus and to be successful. That there is a treatment plan that we can provide. There are many things that you can do to help manage the tinnitus and to give them the confidence to know that it can be managed. There are two types of tinnitus that we normally talk about, and that is subjective versus objective. Subjective being the most common form, and that's when only the patient can hear the tinnitus. It's a sound that we talked about, a ringing, a whistling, a tea kettle, a cricket, and it can be constant, it can come and go, it can be in one ear or both ears. The loudness of the tinnitus can change during the day as well as the pitch. A less common form of tinnitus is objective, and that can actually be detected by a physician with the use of a stethoscope that is placed at the neck, and they can actually hear what the patients will describe as a heartbeat, and it's most commonly a constant sound, but it's a lot less common. So what causes the tinnitus? Tinnitus can be caused by many different health issues, and here are some of the most common causes that we look at. We look at otologic causes, meaning the ear. Is there something anatomical or physically wrong with the ear that may be causing the ringing? Is there any hearing loss? Meniere's disease, which Glenn will talk about in more depth later, is a very symptom-specific disease involving extreme vertigo, ringing in the ear, temporary change in hearing, and an ear fullness. There's also acoustic neuromas, and what those are very small, 100% of the time benign tumors that arise on the nerve of hearing that can cause ringing in the ears. There's a problem in the middle ear called otosclerosis, and what that is a hardening of one of the bones in the middle ear that can cause ringing in the ears, and very often that is managed surgically, and once the problem is resolved, so is the tinnitus. Certain medications can cause ringing in the ears. If you've ever looked at the insert in your medicine bottle, you will see that ringing comes up almost all the time as one of the side effects of medications. But I caution you that not all medications will cause ringing, and just because you may be on a particular medication doesn't mean that your ringing is coming from that medication. There are some ototoxic drugs that are used for chemotherapy patients, and some very strong antibiotics that are used only on several occasions that can cause some ringing in the ears. Excessive smoking and drinking can cause ringing, and general health issues. Many types of different diseases can be a culprit in tinnitus. But as an audiologist, I always look at hearing loss because tinnitus is often the first sign of hearing loss, especially in age-related hearing losses, which we call presbycusis, and noise-related hearing loss for people who are working in noisy factories or use firearms or are constantly at loud concerts. Those types of things can cause a noise-related hearing loss resulting in tinnitus. So is the tinnitus psychological or physiological or a combination of both? Tinnitus is an automatic response. We really have no control over its arrival. And what happens is it activates the limbic system, and that system is our emotional response. We hear a negative sound, it's associated as tinnitus, and the limbic system is activated as your emotional response. Once that happens, a series of events are then put into place. The autonomic or central nervous system is triggered, and that would be your physiologic response. So the body is now reacting to this negative stimulus, and it happens without us thinking about it. And when the tinnitus is perceived as bothersome or negative, our body reacts as if we were in danger. The brain thinks there's a threat, and the body reacts. And this is more commonly known as our fight or flight response. The limbic system is activated because of the negative emotional response. The central nervous system goes into high alert, which sends our endocrine system into high alert. And when that happens, powerful chemicals such as adrenaline and cortisol are released in the body to help us get into the mode to fight this danger.
Okay, so let's have our third question here, which is going to lead into what we're going to talk about next. Our third poll question: how many doctors have you seen for your tinnitus? I've got the poll open. Oh, hold on. Let's see. Let me get this poll question open. There we go. Okay, so let us know, how many doctors have you seen for your tinnitus? And again, what we hear oftentimes is that people, they go to doctor after doctor, either because their first doctor doesn't know what tinnitus is or doesn't know what to do about it, or they're told that there is nothing that they can do about it. So we're really interested to see how many physicians that you've seen. And it looks like people are about done there. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. 29% said that they have only seen one doctor for their tinnitus, 0 to 1, 50% 2 to 3, and only 13% 4 to 5. That's really good to hear.
That is very good to hear. I expected the numbers to be much higher because of the fact that we talked about before that many doctors don't really know what to do, so that leads the patient to seek second, third, and fourth opinions. So how do we go about diagnosing the tinnitus? There are several specialists that we can go to help us in the journey to find out where this is coming from if we can. We can see an otolaryngologist, which is your ear, nose, and throat doctor. We go to an audiologist for testing. We can see a psychologist to help manage some of the things that may be going on in our lives that may be exacerbating the tinnitus. So the next step is really the evaluation and testing. So for the otolaryngologist, if that happens to be your first stop, he's going to take a complete medical history and see if by what you tell him he can piece together what he thinks is going on or a proper direction to send you in. Which ear is the tinnitus? Is it both ears? Is it one ear? Is there any subjective hearing loss? Is there any dizziness? Is there any prior history that he needs to know about? And then he's going to check by looking in your ear for any anatomical abnormalities. Sometimes, very often, it's just a simple buildup of earwax, and once that's taken out, the ringing is much less prominent. The next step would be for the ear doctor to send you to an audiologist. And the goal of the audiologic evaluation is to identify the site of lesion if possible, provide education and reassurance, and to develop a treatment plan so that we can figure out how to help you. A regular audiologic evaluation involves finding out your thresholds, what is the lowest level that you can hear, to see what your speech discrimination ability is, how clearly you hear. We're going to evaluate the middle ear by checking the middle ear pressure and the eardrum mobility. We're going to look at a little reflex in the ear that protects the ear from loud sound. And then we're going to do otoacoustic emissions, which will look at the little hair cells in the inner ear that can get damaged and therefore cause ringing. And sometimes we will go ahead and do a tinnitus evaluation to see if the patient can match the tinnitus for pitch and loudness and masking levels, and use a tinnitus handicap inventory to see what degree of involvement the tinnitus is in your life. What level of anxiety is the tinnitus creating for you? Evaluation later on in developing a treatment plan. Based on everything that we've talked about with the ENT and the audiologist, those results will lead us to know whether audiologically I need to send a patient back to the ENT because maybe this is a surgical case. Or maybe the ENT will order an MRI, an X-ray to look into the inner ear to see if anything is going on. Or we may bring in a psychologist to help manage some of the other issues that are going on in your life. Or bring in the primary care doctor if we think that maybe there's some kind of a systemic problem or some other disease process that may be going on and affecting your general health.
Okay, here's our fourth and last poll question. If you have you purchased any over-the-counter remedies thinking that they were a cure for tinnitus? We ask this because we often hear from patients that, they, as Barbara was talking about before, with Dr. Google, there are lots of things that come up that say, sure, we can cure your tinnitus. And we're always a little bit leery of those because we know that there isn't actually a cure. It's really a matter of managing them. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. 36% of our attendees said yes, they've tried the over-the-counter remedies, but 64% said no. So I'm glad to hear that. But I also, maybe in a follow-up, we can ask what those remedies were and if any of them helped you.
For the most part, a lot of these remedies do not help, but I think if a person feels like they're taking control of the situation and these are not harmful kinds of medications, there really is no downside to that. So once we've done the ENT and the audiologic workup and we have a better sense of what we're dealing with, we can then implement some treatment options. And some of these options would be sound therapy, using a sound machine to reduce the brain's awareness of the ringing. Very often we employ hearing aids for patients who have hearing loss. We want hearing aids to help them hear better, but that additional sound coming into the ear often has a secondary benefit of acting as a tinnitus masker, so you're no longer as aware of the ringing. Counseling and education is very important to demystify the tinnitus, explain to the patient what's going on, and let them know that they're going to be okay. Tinnitus retraining therapy is something that we use a lot, which is based on counseling and sound therapy. There are support groups to help patients know that they are not alone. And a big one is stress management, which will lead to reduction of the ringing, and that can be in the form of yoga, exercise, meditation. And sometimes, as we just talked about, over-the-counter medications can be of some assistance. So as you talked about the tinnitus retraining therapy, this was a program that was started back in about 1990 at the University of Maryland Tinnitus and Hyperacusis Center. And the basis of tinnitus retraining therapy came from a neurophysicist by the name of Paul Jastroboff, who was able to realize that we can habituate to the tinnitus and we can break the cycle and reduce the negative association of the tinnitus. So we know that the perception of tinnitus cannot be treated, but we can change your reaction to the tinnitus and break the negative cycle. So the tinnitus retraining, the Jastroboff model, is based on what we talked about before. Once the limbic system realizes that there's annoyance, we have to break that cycle and not allow the central nervous system and the endocrine system to kick in and give you that fight or flight. We have to break the negative association, allow the habituation to take place, and use sound therapy to reduce the annoyance of the ringing. And again, we're going to just block. Okay, tinnitus management. We're doing the tinnitus retraining therapy, and we're also going to employ education on treatments that can reduce the severity of the tinnitus, getting more sleep, eating properly, exercising is a big stress reducer, staying busy, getting back into activities that bring you pleasure, and using some mindful practices. Counseling is a very important part of this puzzle. We want to change the reaction to the tinnitus, reduce the negativity, and make you understand that you're going to be okay and you're going to be able to manage the tinnitus. And then, of course, sound therapy. We use the sound therapy to add another sound into the room so that the brain does not focus on the ringing. The purpose is to soothe, to reduce the contrast so that you can better ignore your tinnitus, shifting away attention from the ringing. That can be in the form of sound generators, in terms of a sound machine giving you the sound of the ocean or a waterfall, and in the cases where it's appropriate, if there's a hearing loss, using hearing aids.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Barbara, for giving us all that background on tinnitus. And I'm going to go ahead and welcome Glenn Schweitzer, who is, as I mentioned, the author of Rewiring Tinnitus. And he also is himself a tinnitus patient. Glenn, I will let you take it over.
All right, thanks, Cynthia. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Glenn Schweitzer, and I am a tinnitus and Meniere's disease patient. And as Cynthia mentioned before, the author of 2 books, Mind Over Meniere's and Rewiring Tinnitus. I've also been a volunteer ambassador with Veda for the past couple of years. And tonight, I'm going to share my story with you guys. But before I get to that, I want you to understand one thing right now. If you suffer from tinnitus, there's hope. No matter how loud it seems or how much it's bothering you. It's something that I wish someone would have told me sooner because I suffered for a really long time. But today, I'm happy to report that my tinnitus doesn't bother me at all. A few years back, I stumbled onto a few different techniques and exercises that completely changed the way that I react to the sound. And almost overnight, it stopped bothering me. So I'm going to share my story, and by the end, I hope to show you all a few new coping strategies that you can use to find relief, and that while there may not be a cure for tinnitus, you can get to a comfortable place where it stops bothering you and really improve your quality of life. So let's dive in. Okay, so I've had tinnitus for as long as I can remember. Actually, back up, please, Cynthia. Sorry about that. So I've had tinnitus as long as I can remember. I can't say for sure that I was born with it, but I also really can't remember a time without it. For most of my life, the ringing was a constant but quiet, high-pitched tone that never really bothered me, and I really just thought it was normal. It wasn't even until my early teens that I knew otherwise. I remember overhearing my dad and my grandmother having a conversation about their tinnitus and thinking, oh my God, that's not normal, I have that. I always just assumed everyone could hear the quiet, high-pitched sound that I could hear, But at the time, it didn't really matter. It was really just a part of me that I lived with. Well, that first changed in 7th grade. I was 13 years old, and several of my friends were having bar and bat mitzvahs. If you don't know what that is, it's a Jewish ceremony that signifies a child passing into adulthood. And it's usually followed by a large, extravagant, almost wedding-like party. They're a lot of fun, and like weddings, they can be very loud. So most people will temporarily hear ringing in their ears and experience mild hearing loss at some point in their lives, though it's usually only for a short period of time following exposure to loud noise. It doesn't ever last more than a couple hours, maybe a day or two at most. What most people don't realize, though, is that every time this happens, they're damaging their hearing a little bit. And if they have tinnitus to begin with, it can make it a whole lot worse. Okay. Now, next slide. So I remember the first time this happened, and I was driving home with my parents from the bar mitzvah party, and it felt like my ears were stuffed with cotton, and the ringing was just so much louder than normal. I remember my parents trying to explain to me that this was something that could happen when you hear loud music, but at the time I didn't really understand. I just remember not being able to fall asleep and just like laying in bed, tossing and turning, it was just driving me crazy. But of course I was young and resilient, and maybe a day later it had gone back down to normal, and I didn't really think about it. But throughout my life, this pattern would repeat itself. Every loud concert or party that I attended would always end the same way, with a tinnitus spike, a sense of hearing loss, panic and anxiety, having trouble falling asleep, with a slow return back to normal. And one particular example was when I was a junior in high school. I attended this massive 3-day music festival that you can see in the picture here. It was put on every year by a local rock radio station. And for the better part of a day, I remember standing too close to the speaker tower. And it's a shame because I wish I knew better at the time. I know I did damage to my hearing that day. For 3 or 4 days, it sounded like everything was being filtered through tin cans over my ears. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Meniere's disease, which is the cause of my tinnitus. Now, most people will never really know what it's like to face a complex medical diagnosis. And that's not to say they're never going to get sick. They most likely will, and it may be bad at times. But the doctor will most likely be knowledgeable. He'll present treatment options, and you'll be able to move forward with a certain sense of confidence that you're doing the right thing and knowing what to do next. But for the people that are diagnosed with a complicated, rare disease like I was, there are no certainties. There's very little understanding. There's a lot of pain and confusion and despair. So Meniere's disease is an inner ear vestibular disorder. They don't know what causes it, and there's no cure. The symptoms include violent attacks of rotational vertigo, where the room will suddenly start to spin around you and incapacitate you for minutes to hours or even days in more severe cases. This is typically accompanied by a fluctuating and progressive hearing loss, a feeling of fullness and pressure or even pain in the affected ears, and of course, loud tinnitus. And when I first started having these symptoms, I suffered for months without any kind of understanding of what was happening to me and getting worse every single day. Now, I was very much set in denial, thinking that whatever was going on would just magically go away. But of course, that's not what happened. I was starting to have more frequent vertigo attacks. I was becoming dizzy all the time. I was becoming cognitively impaired by brain fog and struggling in school. I was tired all the time because of fatigue. And eventually I did get help, but unfortunately that help came in the form of a very terrible doctor, a local ENT who had a very cold and kind of emotionless disposition. He got angry at me when I started asking questions, and he kind of delivered my diagnosis almost like a death sentence. And it was a really traumatic experience, and I left that day just completely broken. At 24 years old, I had no hope at all of a life that might be worth living or of a future. It was a very dark time in my life, but fortunately it didn't last long. I was lucky to be referred by a family member to a second doctor, a specialist, a neurotologist at the University of Miami, and that doctor changed everything for me. In stark contrast to the first doctor, he was kind and compassionate, and he answered all my questions. He took the time to tell me stories about his other patients that were doing well. He told me that there was no reason just to assume I was going to go deaf, and he really gave me a sense of hope. He painted a picture of a future where I might be okay, and eventually I was. But at the time, I didn't even really know that that was possible. And now I'm happy to report that I haven't had a vertigo attack in a very long time. It's been actually several years since I've had a full-fledged vertigo attack. I still get many of the other symptoms, not necessarily on a daily basis, but sometimes. But my quality of life is much better than it was, and I live a very full and happy life now. So that's all I'm really going to say about Meniere's disease. I'll address it a little bit more, but if you want to learn more about my journey and experience with Meniere's disease, I encourage you to visit my website, mindovermenieres.com. Okay, so as I was able to start improving my Meniere symptoms and kind of get a handle on my health, my tinnitus was getting worse, a lot worse actually. It was the one thing that I couldn't change, and it was bothering me more and more of the time. Now, my tinnitus is a loud, high-pitched tone of around 3,500 hertz, a single frequency tone, although when my Meniere symptoms flare up, I do hear other sounds. I've heard higher pitched tones, lower tones, whooshing, static. I've even heard like a roaring kind of noise before. But the high-pitched tone was enough to drive me crazy all on its own, and during spikes, it would become unbearable. Like many of you, I tried lots of over-the-counter supplements, and nothing really seemed to help. I avoided silence at all costs. I listened to background noise and music while I worked. I had nature sounds playing while I slept, and it was helpful to an extent, but it never really changed anything. But of course, eventually, I did find something that actually helped. It was a simple exercise, and it changed everything for me. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about my process my journey to finding relief. Okay, so I've come to believe that habituation is the answer to tinnitus. So humans are very good at eliminating annoying background noise from our conscious awareness with this mental process called habituation. And it's how we're able to carry on conversations in noisy restaurants, and how we're able to focus and get work done in a busy office environment. And in a very real sense, the brain can turn down the volume of sounds that are not important so we can focus on the ones that are. But there's a problem when it comes to tinnitus. It's impossible to habituate to a sound that we interpret as annoying, threatening, dangerous, or if it carries a negative association of any kind. And there's an evolutionary reason for this. You would never want to not hear the sound of something actually dangerous. But if you deconstruct this for a moment, it's our reaction to the sound of the tinnitus that's the root of the problem. The sounds of tinnitus are objectively harmless, no matter how loud they seem or how intrusive they are. The problem is that we're reacting to the sounds emotionally as if we're in danger. And our brains can't tell the difference between real danger and an imagined threat like tinnitus, so our reaction is the same. We have this stress response, and it doesn't end because our tinnitus doesn't just magically go away. So how did this happen? If the sounds of tinnitus are objectively harmless, why did we develop such a terrible reaction to the sound? Well, of course, it starts with fear. When you suddenly hear a loud noise that nobody else can hear, it's terrifying. And most people can handle a temporary problem, but when it doesn't go away after a couple days, the fear starts to build. So you go to the doctor, but many doctors will tell you, oh, there's nothing you can do, you just have to live with it. And this only serves to further build the fear. Most people's first reaction is to try to ignore it, either by force of will or with background noise. But again, it never actually changes anything. And this won't work at all if you have hearing loss. So I want you to consider something. Emotional, physical, and psychological problems all get worse when we ignore them. So why do we think it'll be any different when it comes to tinnitus? The good news here is that we can change the way we react to the sound. It's the one thing that we actually have the power to change. And when we accomplish this, it stops bothering us, and the habituation process can occur naturally, and we can start to tune it out like we should have been doing all along. Okay, so before I get to the techniques that I use, I want to give you just a little bit more background and context. When I was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, my doctor told me I needed to lower my stress levels. Stress is a big trigger for Meniere's disease and tinnitus, and I needed to find better ways to manage my stress and anxiety. The problem was I suffered from anxiety for most of my adult life. Now, eventually I was able to better manage my stress, and that was with meditation. Meditation was really the only thing that helped me to calm down. But when I first came to meditation, I was very skeptical, and I found it extremely difficult initially. I experimented with a lot of different forms of meditation, trying to find a rhythm, but I was skeptical, and I really struggled with it. So I love this quote. Dan Harris, who is an anchorman for ABC News and the author of a wonderful book about meditation that I highly recommend called 10% Happier, sums up my skepticism perfectly and offers sort of an elegant new way of thinking about the issue, or an elegant solution rather. He says, meditation suffers from a towering PR problem, largely because its most prominent proponents talk as if they have a perpetual pan flute accompaniment. If you can get past the cultural baggage, though, what you'll find is that meditation is simply exercise for your brain. So let's dive into this. Simply put, meditation is the practice of quieting your mind. Now, typically this involves focusing your attention onto a single object or point of awareness, like the sensation of breathing or a mantra, which is a mentally repeated word or phrase. And it's an incredibly simple practice, but it is not, in fact, easy. Now, there are many different benefits to meditation, and just to give you a little idea here, in the short term, meditation can trigger a physiological relaxation response in the body that calms the nervous system and lowers stress levels. And in the long term, it can lead to an overall decrease in stress levels, an increased ability to cope with stress and center yourself more quickly as stress occurs, improvement in focus and concentration, and the ability to fall asleep. And this is just a small taste of some of the benefits of meditation. The problem is that tinnitus makes meditation extremely difficult. Now, I know I never would have coped with Meniere's disease as well as I was able to were it not for meditation. But remember, as my Meniere's symptoms improved, my tinnitus was getting worse, and it completely destroyed my meditation practice. It was very hard to focus on my breath with the sound of sirens blasting in my ears all the time. So, late one night, I was struggling to meditate, lying in bed, when I suddenly was struck with an idea. If meditation is simply the act of focusing your attention onto like one single thing, I thought, you know, I'm constantly fighting to ignore the sound and focus on my breathing, but what would happen if I focused on the sound instead? Now, it seems crazy to focus on the thing that was driving me crazy, but it also was something new, and I was curious, and I tried it, and it changed everything. So a little bit of context here. Anything can be used as the object or the focal point of meditation. In mindfulness meditation, people are encouraged to explore things like pain and boredom in this way. And again, Dan Harris offers advice on handling boredom during meditation in a way that I find is very relevant to what was happening with me and tinnitus with meditation. He says, the advice here is similar to how you should handle pain and fatigue. Investigate. What does boredom feel like? How does it manifest in your body? Whatever comes up in your mind can be co-opted and turned into the object of meditation. It's like in judo, where you use the force of your enemy against him. Okay, so I gave it a shot, and it was difficult, but not for the reasons I was expecting. The first thing that happened was that my mind immediately started wandering. Now, this happens to everybody, especially new meditators. The goal of meditation is to catch your mind when it's wandering and start over again. But this time, my mind wandered away from the sound. And for that brief moment of time, it didn't bother me at all. Because I wasn't fighting to ignore it the whole time, I was able to get into a much more relaxed meditative state. And when it was over, my tinnitus didn't seem as loud. It wasn't actually quieter, but it wasn't bothering me as much. So it didn't seem as loud. And I didn't understand it at the time, but my brain was starting to associate the calm and relaxation of meditation with the sound of my tinnitus. And it was overriding all of the old response of frustration and anxiety. And within a couple of weeks of practicing this every day, my tinnitus stopped bothering me altogether. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the basic technique here. And when we're done, I'm going to address some of the problems that you might run into. But for now, I just want to teach you the basic technique so you have something to try at home. Step one is simply to sit or lay down somewhere comfortable. You don't need to sit on the floor. You can do this in a bed or in a chair or on a couch. Just get comfortable. And if you've never meditated before, set a timer for some easily obtainable goal, like 5 to 10 minutes. Now, the next step is to relax the physical body. So the mind and body are intimately connected. And when you relax the physical body, oftentimes the mind will become very relaxed at this as well. So what I like to do is to use a progressive muscle relaxation routine to consciously relax the muscles in my body. So you start with your feet and you focus on your feet and your toes and you relax the muscles in your feet. Then you move on to your legs and you relax the muscles in your legs and kind of feel the tension go. And you work your way through your body, doing large muscle groups at a time. And once you're done and you're feeling relaxed, you simply shift your focus and attention to the sound of your tinnitus. It's helpful to maintain a mindset of curiosity, as if you were like a scientist observing something interesting for the first time. And remember to breathe naturally. Okay, and lastly, when your mind wanders, and it will, begin again, just start over. Everybody's mind wanders during meditation. This will happen, expect it. Catching yourself when this happens and starting over again is the actual mental exercise of meditation, not some problem that needs to be overcome. Okay, so when I first came up with this, I quickly realized that a lot of people were going to struggle with this. It's difficult to reach the necessary levels of relaxation for this to work if you've never meditated before, or if your tinnitus is very loud or bothersome. So I wanted to address some of these challenges, and there's a lot more that you could do here, but I just want to give you a few tools that you can use right off the bat. So first, if you have very loud, annoying tinnitus, you can use partial sound masking to lower the perceived volume as you meditate. So the idea here would be to put on some music or background or white noise, set it to a volume that masks and blocks out about 80%, 70 to 80% of the volume of your tinnitus. And this way, it'll seem quieter as you meditate to it, easier to get into the meditation. Now, if you're a new meditator, it's also going to be difficult to get into these relaxation states, especially if you're focusing on, the sound of something that's making you feel panic and frustration and anxiety. So using things that help you to relax can be very helpful here. So whether that's, a scented candle you like, or taking a hot bath before you go, or doing some massage with a lacrosse ball, anything that helps you relax physically or mentally is going to help you to get deeper into the meditation. And there's a lot you can do here. We don't have time to go into everything, but I just want to give you a few ideas. Also, there's a difference between meditating and listening to the sound. Listening is just a very passive sort of activity, whereas meditation is a very active, focused, controlled sort of activity. So you're concentrating and focusing on the sound and bringing your attention back. And lastly, I want to stress that the benefits of this are cumulative. You will most likely not experience the benefits of this right away. Daily practice is going to be necessary. You're trying to create these new connections in your brain, and that's going to take a little bit of time. So in the short term, you're going to want to have some other coping strategies to help you get through everything. Anything that promotes relaxation, that helps to mask the sound or distracts you in some way are going to be helpful here. Okay, real quick, in addition to the meditation, there's also a lot more you can do to improve your quality of life with tinnitus. Things like improving stress, discovering triggers, improving sleep. We're going to talk about a couple of these things, but the point is that there's a lot of different ways that you can incrementally increase your quality of life. Okay, the most important of these is tracking your tinnitus and figuring out what your triggers are. Your tinnitus may seem constant, but the sounds of tinnitus often can change in the sound or volume or number of sounds or intensity, and most people refer to this as a tinnitus spike. They're very difficult to deal with, and they might seem to happen randomly, but more often than not, they can be triggered by some internal change within your body or some external factor. So identifying the variables that exacerbate your tinnitus and avoiding them when possible is going to be very helpful in improving your quality of life and reducing the day-to-day fluctuations. Now, as you can see here, these are all anecdotally reported common tinnitus triggers. We don't need to go through all of this list right now, as I have a more elegant solution for you all. But journaling is the answer here. And there's a reason for this. If your tinnitus spikes in the afternoon and it's the result of something you ate for breakfast, you're probably not going to make that connection automatically. There's just too many variables. But when you have the right information in front of you, it's very easy to find the patterns. The patterns sort of jump out at you. So I created a one-page PDF journaling tool. to help you track all of the right variables. You simply fill it out each day. It helps you track all sorts of different things about your lifestyle, your tinnitus, the medications, your diet, a lot of different things. And all you have to do is go back and compare the days when your tinnitus was at its worst to look for the patterns and what might have been in common amongst those days. And you can also check what was in common on your best days to see what might be helping you. You can download this tool for free at rewiringtinnitus.com/journal. That's free to everybody. Okay, so real quick, I want to address stress, because stress is a trigger for just about everybody. And there's a lot you can do here to better handle stress and improve your quality of life. So counseling and therapy are two, very important tools. It's something that I've used personally and found to be very helpful, because tinnitus can be traumatic, especially if you've been suffering for a really long time. Finding the right therapist is going to be what's most important here, but it's an excellent tool for managing stress. And if therapy is too expensive or out of your budget, support groups can be very helpful, and there are online and in-person tinnitus support groups. We touched on this before, physical stress management. Stress finds its way into our body as tension and aches and pains. So reducing physical stress can go a long way towards reducing mental stress. Things like professional massage or trigger point massage with a lacrosse ball or foam roller, acupuncture, taking a hot bath or a sauna. These are all things that could be helpful. Anything that reduces physiological stress is going to be helpful at managing stress altogether. And of course, exercise is going to be very helpful here as well. Okay, and the last thing I want to touch on is sleep, because obviously the noise can make it hard for you to fall asleep, and sleep deprivation can make your tinnitus worse. So it's a little bit of a vicious cycle here. So there's a couple things sleep, but just to give you a few ideas, one thing that I find very helpful is to improve your sleep routine, so that you want to go to bed and wake up at the same time every day and do the same thing each night before you go to bed. So your body starts to associate that routine with falling asleep, and it can kind of help to initiate the pressure to fall asleep. Also, of course, you want to avoid caffeine for at least 8 hours before you go to bed if you're having trouble sleeping. Also, turning off your backlit screens, that's going to be your phones, tablets, TVs, an hour and a half before you go to bed. The blue light spectrum that's emitted from these screens mimics sunlight and can block the production of melatonin, which is what your brain uses to regulate day and night. So turning off the TV, the tablet, reading a book, or spending time with family is going to be good here. Or you can get blue light blocking glasses for inexpensive on Amazon, or one of many blue light blocking apps for your computers and phones and tablets. That can be helpful as well. And lastly, you want to optimize your bedroom. So you want it to be pitch black. You can cover up any source of ambient light and use things like blackout curtains, which are available at most department stores, or even simpler than that, wear a sleep mask over your eyes to make it pitch black can be very helpful. Also, most people don't know this, but the research has shown that the ideal temperature for sleep is much colder than people think. It's 62 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And you don't want to be cold under the covers, but if you're having trouble falling asleep, turning the temperature down a couple degrees might be very helpful. And of course, background noise and white noise can be helpful when you're falling asleep to mask the tinnitus if you still have some of your hearing left. So improving sleep is going to go a long way here. And I think that's it for me, you guys. I hope you guys found this helpful. I think we're going to open up to some questions now.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was a great story. And also, I mean, I love hearing about your personal experience and how, you kind of worked through the whole meditation thing to find a thing that worked for you. We do have some questions, and I want to start with one. We'll start with one for you, Barbara. There's someone who asked about hyperacusis, and I remember in one of the slides you had said something about that hyperacusis, that you can develop a sensitivity to sound with tinnitus. Can you talk about the connection between tinnitus and hyperacusis?
Yes, absolutely. Very often hyperacusis is associated with a problem with the hair cells in the inner ear. Damage to those hair cells translates to the brain's inability to properly manage sound levels. So what sounds loud to you may be very loud to somebody else. And of course, the hyperacusis is associated with the tinnitus because you have the damaged hair cells, you have the tinnitus. So there is a direct correlation there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Barbara. I've got some other questions that were being brought to me, but I remember one person had asked Glenn, and I know you've talked about this, about using medical marijuana for treatment of tinnitus, and I know that's kind of a sensitive subject, but do you want to talk about your experience with that?
Sure. Although to minor correction, just for clarification, what I have a little bit of experience with is CBD, which is the non-psychoactive medicinal component of marijuana, but the part that doesn't get you high. So it's taken, it's available now, like, you know, it's legal in every state. It's not like medicinal marijuana where it's only legal in certain states. But yeah, so this is something I came to fairly recently, using CBD oil. And I had known about it for a long time, and I didn't really expect much. But in terms of a tool to manage anxiety and stress, it is one of the most, it's one of the most powerful things I've ever come across. Now, I don't find that it directly affects my tinnitus in any meaningful way, but indirectly it's helping a lot because it's helping to manage my stress and anxiety to such an incredible level that my tinnitus is much easier to deal with when, you know, I'm calm and everything's good. So many people do report that, you know, taking CBD as a supplement, you know, makes the tinnitus seem calmer and more manageable. My gut is that they're just lowering their anxiety and stress levels, and it's helping them to habituate naturally, maybe speeding up the process. I don't have any experience with medicinal marijuana in specific and tinnitus, but you know, CBD is very much related, and I've been having a lot of success with that. If anyone's interested, the product I've been using, it's called Charlotte's Web. CWHemp.com is the website. I have no affiliation with them. That happens to be the product I've been using. So yeah, that's been my experience.
Thanks, Glenn. So here's a question. I think I'll start with you, Barbara, and then Glenn, maybe you can talk about your experience as well. Is tinnitus especially triggered by changes in barometric pressure? So from a physiological standpoint, Barbara, can you address that? And then Glenn, maybe you can tell us about your recent experience with Hurricane Irma.
Okay.
I'm not really aware of any particular physiologic correlations between barometric pressure and tinnitus. The only correlation I can make is if you are, let's say, flying with a cold that day and your whole system is inflamed and that's irritating the tinnitus. But barometric pressure, I've really never seen a whole lot of research in terms of that correlation.
So
we hear from the research perspective. Glenn, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, so well, luckily, changes in the weather and barometric pressure seem to be, from what I've seen, a much bigger trigger for people with Meniere's disease rather than tinnitus specifically. Why that is, I have no idea. I'm lucky that has not really been one of my main triggers. It's happened before, but it's rare. So like you said, the Hurricane Irma, like I know a lot of people that in Florida with Meniere's disease and tinnitus might have been triggered by that. I was lucky that it did not trigger me in that way. But just from interacting with people, I know that it is a trigger, at least for a lot of Meniere's disease patients, and then I guess by extension, tinnitus patients. And you know, it's one of those things, like we obviously can't control the weather. So what I tell people generally is it's just a helpful thing to know. Like the more information you have about how your body reacts to any trigger is going to be valuable because you may not be able to change the weather, but if you know that the weather is going to be bad, you can take steps to prepare and kind of be ready for it. So that's like an empowering step, and you know, a little bit of control, you can exert control over an otherwise uncontrollable situation.
Thanks, Glenn. So I have a couple of questions about certain supplements. I have someone asking about lemon bioflavonoids and someone asking about melatonin. Barbara, do you know anything about those supplements and whether they have any evidence supporting their treatment for tinnitus?
I'm actually not familiar with the lemon bioflavonoid, but I know a lot of ENT doctors that do prescribe lipoflavonoids with the
I think
hope,
that's what she's talking about.
yeah, with the hope that it will improve the inner ear circulation. But again, there's really no definitive research that that is actually going to decrease your level of tinnitus. A lot of people take it. Some people feel that it does help them. And if that's the case and they do feel that they're getting some relief, then I'm all for it.
I feel the same exact way. It's never helped me. I tried that more as a treatment for, it was more as like one of the things I tried when I was first diagnosed with Meniere's disease. I wasn't maybe specifically trying to address the tinnitus at that point. It didn't change anything. But I agree with Barbara. If someone is finding relief from it, I mean, you know, it's over the counter, it's readily available, then that's wonderful. Like if it works for you, that's great. I just haven't experienced any relief from it, and I don't know many people who have.
Okay, great. So I have two other questions. I know we're running out of time, possibly running over, but I'm going to throw them out anyway. And I'm going to combine two questions. One person was saying that their tinnitus varies from day to day. Is that typical? And the other person is asking, is this typically a lifelong condition? Would either of you like to address that?
I can speak to my own experience. It doesn't change every day for me, but I do, like I mentioned in my story, I do get a lot of like wild fluctuations. I have interacted with many people who do experience day-to-day fluctuations. Sometimes they're able to identify, you know, what the triggers are, sometimes not. I personally believe that everyone has the potential to habituate. I know it seems like if it's changing wildly every day, like that would make it a difficult problem to overcome because it's not just one constant sound. But I've seen people, I know people who have had similar types of tinnitus, and they were still able to get to this place where it stopped bothering them. So I don't know that it's common, but it's not uncommon, let's say. And while it might be more frustrating and more difficult to deal with, don't lose hope. Don't start thinking that that's a reason that you can't do something about this, because I firmly believe that it's possible for everyone to habituate.
Barbara, do you want to address the lifelong condition question?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's a tough question to answer because a lot of it depends upon whether or not there was a diagnosis. As in Glenn's case, he has a possibly lifelong situation where tinnitus is a major component, but he is able to manage it. Random tinnitus with no definitive diagnosis, it's very hard to know whether it's going to be with you all the time. And bottom line, even if it is, if you have gone the steps to be able to cope and manage, then even though it's lifelong, you still have your strategies to be able to deal with it.
Great.
And I'll add to that. If I could just add to that real quick. So I have tinnitus. I still hear it when it's quiet, but it doesn't affect my quality of life at all. So if I have it for the rest of my life, like the thought of that doesn't concern me, because, you know, there might not be a cure, but if it's not a problem for you anymore, it's not a problem. It doesn't intrude into my life anymore. It doesn't interfere with my quality of life. So I think, you know, learning these coping skills is just as effective ultimately as a cure would be.
Thank you. So the last question I'll just throw out there, and I'll go ahead and respond to this and see if you guys have anything else to say. Someone asked if they can find a psychologist for tinnitus specifically. I would recommend, if you're looking for and I'll expand this to counselor, because you don't necessarily have to see a psychologist. You could see a clinical social worker or a counselor of some other sort, to look for someone who specifically works with patients who either have a chronic illness, who works with patients with anxiety and depression, because those are two of the symptoms that are associated with tinnitus. You might even ask the counselor if they've ever experienced tinnitus themselves. because a lot of, it's very common, and you might get someone who has that personal experience. It's a good idea to interview your counselors, before you go in and meet with them in person. So with that, I'd like to thank our presenters so much. Barbara and Glenn, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experience, and thank you all for attending. We'll have a recording of this available on YouTube, and please also participate in our post-webinar survey and give us feedback on how it went and what other topics you'd like to hear about. Good night, everyone.